The Sound of Drums is really much more interesting than it is successful. Building off Utopia is the second part of the three-part finale, helping to build the longest single story in the revived series. The Sound of Drums does an excellent job moving the characters along and getting everything where it needs to be for the requisite cliffhanger. Unfortunately, Davies' weaknesses when it comes to plotting are all at play here. While Utopia took advantage of a leisurely pace and conventional plot in order to do some nice setup, The Sound of Drums isn't afforded the same luxury. Utopia came out of left field, with the last 10 minutes taking the audience by surprise. Now the audience knows the game is afoot, so the stakes have changed. The Sound of Drums kicks off with everything in full swing, and Davies has to ratchet up the tension from there. The result is some solid character work, but work that comes with plot points and setups occasionally feeling a bit forced. That's especially true when it comes to the ideas that will be important to the resolution of the next part, The Last of the Time Lords, but we'll get to that in due course. I actually quite like Russell T Davies' conception of the Master here. Occasionally that gleefully insane pantomime villain shtick grates a bit, but John Simmons is a good enough actor to manage the heavy lifting, and Davies' idea of the character is strong enough to hold it together. If originally in the classic era Robert Holmes and Barry Letts originally imagined the Master as Moriarty to the Doctor's Holmes, then Davies reimagined him here in the modern era as the Joker to the Doctor's Batman. And, let me put on record that I think John Simm does a great job. There's a sense of a complete disconnect from reality in his performance, but also the sense of a larger philosophical game played with his opponent.
Who are you?
I am the Master. And these are my friends.
I'm sorry.
Can't you hear it, Mrs. Rook?
What do you mean?
The drumbeat.
Davies does an excellent job rooting the ideological conflict between the Master and the Doctor in more than we've just got previous. Earlier iterations of the Master had a tendency to keep the Doctor alive, despite his knack for foiling their plans. Sometimes this was easy enough to explain, as a demonstration of the character's inferiority complex, a pathological need for the recognition and validation he couldn't get by just killing the Doctor. On the other hand, sometimes it was just because the script had nowhere else to go. Davies managed to get to the nub of their differences and to explain the weird codependence that really does exist. Essentially, boiled down to its smallest elements, the Master just really wants to prove a point to the Doctor here. Lucy Saxon was a nice entry point to the world of politics, but she was also a perversion of the principle of the Doctor's companion. The Master tends to ally with aliens in his schemes. He was introduced plotting with the Autons back in the 70s, but his chocolate-flavored allies here are intended as another ideological jab at the Doctor. The Sound of Drums picks up directly where the characters left off in Utopia. Much like he consciously regenerated into a younger and more hyperactive young man to mirror his adversary, the Master has clearly picked up a trick or two from his rival. There's none of the typical "I am the Master and you will obey me" nonsense. Apparently the Master has been watching long enough to figure out how to do things right. That's one of the wonderful things about Davies' reinvention of Doctor Who. The villains have generally evolved enough that they can now exploit the Doctor's weaknesses. Bad Wolf revealed a Dalek fleet that managed to outmaneuver the Doctor by simply waiting in the darkness while he drifted in and out of their timeline. While he travelled through time and space, they waited slowly and built themselves up from nothing. However, if the Daleks are smart enough to play the Doctor's weaknesses, the fact he doesn't stick around is a knack in the follow-through. The Master succeeds by claiming the character's strengths for his own. In the Terror of the Autons, the Master's first story, the Master arrived on Earth dressed in ceremonial robes and immediately began brainwashing and plotting to help an alien force invade the planet. In The Sound of Drums, he is a democratically elected Prime Minister who is widely loved and has built his way up. He has clearly come a long way. It's telling that the Arcadial network is essentially built on the same technology as the TARDIS. Like the Doctor's TARDIS, the Master has finally learnt the advantage of blending in. Rather than trying to immediately seize control of the planet, he's happy to engage with the cultures and customs of Earth. The Doctor was always more tolerant of other cultures, while the Master was always prone to dismiss them. He seems to have spent a lot of time engaging with Earth culture here, though. He just perverts it to serve his own end. Instead, the Master spent most of the Pertwee era watching the Doctor work with UNIT and save the planet from alien menace after alien menace. The third Doctor might have been an old curmudgeon, but he's the most established iteration of the character. It appears the Master has learnt a thing or two about the Doctor's ability to court human allies, however, and to earn their respect. Furthermore, the Master secures his position as PM by repelling alien invasions and essentially dealing with them. In The Runaway Bride, we see Mr. Saxon harness public support by successfully directing a military response to an alien invasion, i.e. shooting down the big web star. Of course, the Doctor probably wouldn't have used tanks, but the general idea is it's still inherited from his foe. In Smith and Jones, we learn that he has apparently been encouraging Great Britain to look at the stars. The Doctor, of course, encourages that sort of curiosity. The Master, however, exploits it. It's quite telling that the Doctor tends to associate with the middle and lower classes in the new series, while the Master has explicitly targeted the upper class. While Rose came from the Powell estate in London, apparently Lucy Saxton was educated at Rodine. While the Doctor tends to get along better with the common people and is suspicious of authority, the Master seems to prefer to mingle with the rich and powerful. Indeed, that trait remains consistent between here and the portrayal in The End of Time, where he takes advantage of the wealthy Naismith family. In fact, even the drumbeat that the Master hears inside his head resembles the underbeats of the Doctor Who themed music. In many ways, the Master is just the Doctor flipped around. Of course, that's not a new idea. The very names of the characters and the nature of the Time Lords suggest that they're clearly intended to contrast one another. However, Davies executes this concept much better than a lot of his predecessors, and this is easily the best portrayal of the character in well over a quarter of a century. Davies also uses the Master as a character reasonably well. Davies isn't exactly the most subtle of social commentators, and sometimes that can grate. Indeed, his issues with the United States feel especially hand-fisted here. However, his criticisms of the political system feel quite valid. Sitting down after winning an electoral landslide, one of Saxon's cabinets observes, "But if we could get down to business, there's the very matter of policy, of which we have very little." Indeed, the Master's complete lack of any government policy comes up quite a bit here. When Martha confesses she was going to vote for him, the Doctor asks, "Why'd you say that? What was his policy? What did he stand for?" After some hesitation, Martha confesses, "I don't know. He always sounded good." It's very clear that the people of Great Britain just elected a Prime Minister running on a third or fourth party ticket with no policy to speak of, without anyone thinking twice about it. Of course, we're also told that a subtle form of brainwashing is in effect here, but it's also stated that it isn't too strong. After all, the Master can't proclaim himself as Emperor of the world yet. He just got elected Prime Minister. And the press is passively complicit as well. It's one low-level journalist who seems to have stumbled across the inconsistency. The thing is, it's obvious. The forgery is screaming out, and yet no one can see it. Davies has occasionally been a bit blunt in his portrayal of political figures, but The Sound of Drums is downright scathing as a critique of British politics. That said, a lot of his criticisms can be seen reasonably grounded in the Age of Spin, but the only way to get close to anyone of importance is to claim to be writing a puff piece for the front page. Like his portrayal of reality television as a literal meat grinder in Bad Wolf, Davies uses the science fantasy trappings of Doctor Who to offer his own comment on British culture. However, his portrayal of the Americans does seem a little vindictive here. Again, this is something that has been peppered throughout his Doctor Who work, but it reaches an apex here. Davies introduces us to the arrogant and overbearing Coleman Winters, who feels like he can just bully the British Prime Ministers around. So America isn't completely in charge, the Master asks. Since Britain elected an arse? Yes, Winters clarifies. Winters is portrayed repeatedly as a moronic arse. Although he claims that the first contact can't take place on any sovereign soil, he's obsessed with stealing the credit for it. "I want the whole thing branded in my seal of office, not the UN, he advises. You got that? When the Toclafine arrive, he promptly assumes that they are calling him Master, accepts the title and evokes God over all the same lines. It's a rather blunt caricature of George W. Bush, playing off the resentment that quite a few people feel about their special relationship. However, it's just too easy, it's too obvious, and it's essentially too crass. Davies' portrayal of Winters feels like a clumsy and populist swipe at the expense of another nation. It's not offensive or anything, it's just lazy and it plays to the worst sort of nationalism. The fact that Davies spends so much of the last of the Time Lords so painstakingly resetting everything that has happened, while pointedly leaving Winters dead, seems like a very cheap shot indeed. Then again, you could probably argue that the Master's execution of the President here is yet another flip side to the Doctor. The Doctor's sense of British pride is genuinely more constructive than that, while the Master expresses a more aggressive and belligerent form of nationalism. After all, he's still technically Prime Minister, albeit much more as well, when he starts building an invasion fleet that hopes to build the new Time Lord Empire. The introduction of the Time Vortex into the backstory of the Master at least officially confirms he is certifiably insane, accounting for a lot of his actions in the classic series. It also makes his history a little bit more tragic. More than that, though, it suggests the reason why the Doctor ran away from Time Lord society. Of course, we'll never get an official reason why the Doctor ran away, because it's just too big a question, and any answer would inevitably be too small. However, while I don't mind the theory that the Doctor ran because he saw something in the vortex, I prefer to think the Doctor took Susan to stop her from having to look into the vortex. That raises the question of what would happen to his children. The idea would at least explain why the Doctor felt necessary to raise his youngest relative outside the confines of the Time Lord system. So, The Sound of Drums is packed with interesting ideas, that's for certain. Plotting and pacing, however, seem a little bit clumsy. Davies tends to overload his finales, and this is no different here. He has already done a lot of setup, so The Sound of Drums hits the ground running. However, it winds up relying on a lot of handy technobabble in order to keep things ticking over, as the stakes continually raise. The perception filter thing seems like a handy plot device clumsily inserted with no real justification. except that Davies needs to get the trio onto the Valiant for the next part. The Archangel network is crucial to the resolution of the Last of the Time Lords, but here he gets kind of lost in the mix. Watching over this episode again, there's no "oh yes" moment when the Doctor discusses the satellites. No point on repeat viewing when innocuous detail proves to be invaluable. Instead, it just seems like Davies gave as much information as he could in the space allotted. The result is that his use in the next episode was awkwardly set up, rather than seeming like a natural development in hindsight. Overall, I don't really think this episode is too bad. Yes, it has its problems, but it certainly isn't as bad as next week. We'll get to that. The wheels will come off in the resolution, but I still think that Davies' three-part finale has no shortage of ambition. However, Davies has always been better at characters and theme, rather than plotting, so keeping a plot moving consistently across 3 stories has been a little bit too much of an ask. The Sound of Drums has its fair share of interesting and intriguing ideas, just a lack of cohesion to really cement them together. However, in terms of an overall score, I'm afraid you shall have to wait until next time.